Good evening all and welcome. As you can imagine, police and the emergency services have seen their fair share of horrific things, which is why I warn you now, this video and the stories are not for the faint of heart. You have been warned. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I'm an emergency medical technician, and about a month ago we got a call for a really bad car accident with 2 passengers. I found out after the fact that a teenage guy still in high school and his girlfriend were doing 90 plus miles an hour in a Mustang, and a cop saw them and went to pull them over. But instead the guy took off. The guy took a turn way too fast and slid into a pole. We got to the scene and found the car had slid into the pole and wrapped itself around it. It almost looked like a game of horseshoe. The passenger side hit the pole, and his girlfriend was very clearly dead, likely on impact. Her head was flattened on the side, her eyes hanging out, with brain oozing out of her nose and most major bones clearly broken. The teenage guy was semi-conscious. He was looking around in shock, trying to figure out what had just happened. He had blood coming from his ears and nose. His right cheekbone caved in. We managed to get him out the car with surprising ease, as the driver's side of the car wasn't damaged bad enough to jam the door shut. We cut off his clothes, put him on a stretcher with a collar on, and immediately put him in the ambulance and floored it the whole way to the hospital. I could see every time he took a breath, his broken ribs would pop in and out while I listened to his lungs fill with blood. I could see major bruising take place on his torso and he was starting to fade. I just became an EMT a few months before this, so I was new and didn't really know what to do. All of a sudden he stopped breathing and we hooked him onto a ventilator. I was frantic. This was one of my first major calls and I'd never seen anything like this. My more experienced partner, a paramedic, remained calm and tried to assure me that everything would be okay. And just as I was starting to calm down a bit more, the patient went into cardiac arrest. I began performing CPR, and I could feel his ribs were broken as I performed it, and my partner hooked him up onto the life support. Shortly after we arrived to the hospital, my partner and I rushed out of the ambulance to get the patient in. A trauma team was already waiting for us, and my partner told them everything that happened to us as the guy's mum arrived. She was frantic, and I had to try and keep her away from her son as she asked me what happened. I explained to her what happened and that he was on life support and a ventilator, and the hysterical mum was like, "Life support?" "Yes, he's on life support. We're getting him to surgery as we speak." At this point, my partner comes back over to me after relaying all the information to the trauma team, and the mum asked me, "So you mean to tell me if you took him off life support, he'd be dead?" And my partner solemnly replies back with, "No. What I mean to tell you is that he is dead, and we're trying to bring him back." We excused ourselves as we had more calls to attend to. We later found out from the surgeon on hand that about 15 minutes after the arrival of the patient, he succumbed to his injuries. It's so haunting to me, hearing his lungs fill with blood, and seeing his broken ribs move with his breathing, seeing his look of shock as he coughed up blood from his nose and mouth. I can't handle coins anymore because the metal smell reminds me of the smell of blood. I can't see things with ketchup or syrup or similar because it reminds me too much of all the blood. I can't unsee any of this stuff, and it haunts me. I have nightmares frequently about it. I don't think I'm going to last in this job. This was told to me by my dad when I was 12. Even now, when I ask him about the story, he can remember every vivid detail like it just happened last week. And when he was just a rookie, he had to conduct nighttime roadblocks meant to catch drunk drivers. They had done it many times before, and this night started routine enough for them. That was until this Toyota Corolla drove up to them with what looked like a white blanket on its roof, flapping in the wind. They thought it was weird, but did not see anything amiss about it. One of them even joked that this guy was multitasking by drying his laundry and driving home at the same time. The laughs stopped when the lone car came closer, and all of them saw what looked like a woman in white lying face down on top of the car. The woman seemed to slide like a slug backwards until she disappeared behind the car, as it eventually came to a stop in front of them. It took a few minutes for my dad's team to recompose themselves as they stared at each other, as if to say, "You guys saw that, right?" The most senior of them finally stepped up and shot the unusual question to the driver. There was a noticeable quiver in his voice as he made conversation and asked for him to step out the vehicle. My dad's team inspected the whole vehicle, including the boot, and found nothing strange in it. The driver was a good-looking staff sergeant in the army who was heading home from a company event earlier that night and admitted to having a few cans of beer. He said he laid down to sleep in his bunk to sleep it off, hence why he was driving home at 4 a.m. He passed their sobriety test, and they started to ask him if he saw anything strange during his drive. Initially he said no, but after more questioning he mentioned that he had to swerve to avoid what looked like a bird that was flying upside down. It was spooky, but he didn't think that it was a detail worth sharing with police officers. The senior then told the guy to chill out at a 24-hour coffee shop before heading home, as the locals believe that if a malevolent spirit follows you, making a pit stop confuses them so they can't set up shop in your house. After some confusion of his own, the driver finally caught on and nodded in agreement. After the guy left, they called into the station and cut the night short. We never knew what happened to that driver. I hope he's alright. Me and my colleague, who joins me in the car halfway there, meet police outside the outskirts of town. It was fairly obvious that the house was run down and practically grey due to age, but if you focus enough you could see that it was yellow as the actual house colour. It didn't help though that it was 8 in the morning in December in Sweden. Saying, for those of you who don't know, it's pitch black with knee-high snow. The entrance was weirdly enough in the back of the house. It had a small stairway, so there was difficulty in bringing the stretcher in. We walk up the stairs and see an obvious break-in attempt. Broken glass, window off the door, like someone grabbed the handle from the inside. The police say it was an anonymous call about the place, so it might have been a burglar or an uninvited family member. Police say the family had practically no connection to the woman anymore. So we walk in, and we're met by a heavy stench. So we walk back to the car to gear up for any other action needed. We walk in again, and now we notice there are several padlocks on each door in the narrow hallway, and tape to seal it further. Most shocking to me was that the bathroom door was straight ahead of us. It had 2 padlocks and full silicone sealing along the cracks. This is where we met the stench again, through our masks. To the right was the living room where we walked in, and she was there, laying in front of the couch, another 4 padlocks on the balcony door. She lay on her side with an electrical heater in the way, and of course close to her face, and what could only look like a blanket on top of her. Upon further inspection, her face was gone, surrealistic, dried, moving, worms, holes. We lifted her blanket off the body, which apparently was a picnic blanket, the kind where there is isolation and plastic underneath and fleece on top. When this was moved, it looked like a drowning accident. Blue and green bloating, and various liquids. The only option here was a body bag. Grabbing her wrists was like sinking your hands into putty. The worms falling out what would have been the mouths and eyes, and seeing them crawl away in search of new feeding grounds. The body bag did not hold the moist stench that filled our lungs, and later on that day we prepared the body as well we could, seeing the rotting. There was no possibilities in embalming. We figured that she'd been in the living room for over a month. We brushed a special bacterial killing fluid over her. That's all we could really do besides removing as much of the worms as we could. They had made it to the lungs, going to the heart. When we had the casket ready and her in a body bag in it, we had to prep it with 2 kinds of bacterial killing powders and 3 kinds of spray that kill any kind of smell or rot, and it worked for a whole 5 minutes. 2 weeks later, the funeral finally took place, and the body can only be assumed to be practically one big blob by now. The body had been soaked up into the wood, making it appear like driftwood. This meant that she had been seeping out through the body bag. The family came along into the church and only 15 others. They asked about the minor smell like someone had farted, but for us it was obvious that this was not going to be pleasant. Half hour in, and the whole church was filled with the smell. Another half hour goes by and 3 people leave early. When the ceremony was done, they came with a complaint about the smell, and they were going to ask about it in the gathering reception after the funeral. We didn't have the stomach to tell them that they most likely didn't have a body in there anymore. It's one incident I will never forget. My fire department was called out for a search on a missing person. He was supposed to report back to prison on a work release on Wednesday. We were dispatched on Saturday after he was reported as a no-show when someone found his car on a back road. We assumed he had parked there, then called someone to pick him up. Okay, a few hours of wandering in the woods, we won't find anything and we'll go home. But after 35 minutes, we found him. He's maybe 50 yards off the gas pipeline easement, just standing there facing away. You'd think he was taking a leak, until you see the rope. He had taken his life in the worst way. The tree he'd attached the rope to wasn't strong enough, so he didn't break his neck. His feet were on the ground. He strangled himself. Probably took a while. He stood there, deceased, for 3 days. We held his body as our captain climbed the tree to cut the rope. We wrapped him in a tarp and carried him nearly a mile through the woods back to his car. We sat there for 2 hours while the forensic team surveyed the site and the car. I was a volunteer firefighter for 17 years. The guy is the one that still appears in my dreams. 14 years later, as I walk up the gas line trail, I always see him standing there. I worked as an agency nurse in a small county hospital for a while. We got a call from a nursing home saying that one of their patients was going downhill. We went through all the motions, got the ER bed ready, MD was also waiting, EMTs pull up, and they're actively doing chest compressions. The paramedic is breathing for him with an ambu bag, or bag valve mask. The MD asks why he hasn't been intubated, as the drive was half hour away from the nursing home to the hospital. The paramedic just said, "You can try if you want, I can't move his head." The MD asks me to get a rolled up blanket to place under his shoulder. It makes it to where the doc can see the vocal cords so he can intubate the patient, for all you non-medical professionals hearing this. I place the blanket under his shoulder and his head is floating off the stretcher, like he's doing a crunch or something. I applied pressure to his forehead to push his head down, but it didn't budge. I pushed hard enough to the point where I thought any harder I'm going to snap this guy's neck. Keep in mind he's flatlined this whole time, and we're continuing to give him breaths with the ambu bag in between all of this, but he's basically gone. The doc gets up and pushes on his head, and snap, the head goes limp. The doc pronounces time of death, and I'll never forget the sound. It was actually very close to the noise you hear in movies when someone breaks someone else's neck. The doc ordered an x-ray after it was all said and done, and his neck snapped at C45, a clean break. We called the nursing home to let them know he had passed, and I asked the nurse to read me off his story. He had ankylosing spondylitis combined with a stroke. He didn't move or get out of bed. Laying still without movement for such a long period of time removed the flexibility in his neck and caused his cervical spine to basically fuse. When we applied pressure to his forehead, we snapped his neck. It was the worst feeling ever, when you do more harm than good. My brother shared this story with me. He's an EMT. The patient in question is an obese male in excess of 500 pounds and is unable to lift himself from the couch. He has been in that state for several weeks when they attempt to remove him from said couch. A massive chunk of flesh begins to peel away from the body, exposing his muscle and vertebrae. The patient loses consciousness. Unable to remove the man from the couch without killing him, they attempt to keep him alive while he is still attached to the couch. The fire department is called, and they cut the couch away, and are hopeful to get him to the hospital intact. Fast forward to the ER, the surgeon concluded that there was no way to remove him from the couch and save his life. Attempting to remove the couch would expose too much of his body to the outside. That is, if he could survive the surgery. He would not survive the following infections. So, he subsequently passed. My second story is an ambulance was called for a homeless man who complained of severe foot pain. Upon trying to inspect the foot, it comes off. It pulls away like an apple plucked from a tree, revealing the man's leg bones and a horrendous infection. He would survive, but not until his leg had been amputated mid-thigh. I'm what they call a crime scene cleaner. Technically, we are biohazard remediation and forensic cleaners. We clean up blood, body fluids, and infectious materials you don't want hanging around. The worst mess I had to clean up was a man who murdered his wife and 2 infant children, and then turned the gun onto himself. Rumor was he was having financial difficulty and about to lose a really top-paying job. He was also used to providing the good life for his family and was very ashamed. A week before he committed his gruesome acts, he was actually diagnosed with severe depression, but refused to seek help for it. I went to the children's bedroom and saw little bloody handprints on the walls. I went home and couldn't sleep that night. I didn't dare tell my wife. It was a really sad story. Sometimes the less you know about a case, the better. I grew up in an old Victorian-era boarding house. Everything about that town, that house, and its surrounding area is just creepy. We saw and felt all kinds of weirdness in there, but that's only the beginning of my experience. Hot spot, cold spots, apparitions of a man who looked like he was dressed in a suit and fedora, who was always with a young woman who was wearing a dress, like an old school teacher from when the house was used as a boarding house, and the ghosts of the people that had been lynched from an old pecan tree from my backyard. I'm used to seeing some messed up stuff at this point, and that's only one part of it. Fast forward to 2014. I enlisted in the US Navy and got assigned TAD to the USS Sternet in between my A and C schools. I was coming back to the ship one night, and I see someone aloft. That's not right. No one's supposed to be aloft at night, but someone probably got an okay from it somewhere, so whatever. I see them walking around, and then I decide to get the brow and look up, but don't see anyone. Guess they went inside already. I didn't think anything about it. The next morning we go underway. I went up to the smoke deck lake one night on the underway, and while on my way there, I see the upper half of a guy's face, and I could see coveralls with his second-class crows visible through the porthole window on one of the airlock doors that you go through on the outside. I make eye contact and shuffle over to him. He shuffled over too. Okay, I'll open it. Whatever. I open it, look around, and don't see him. He probably went over for another cigarette. I climb up there and I see some people in the dark. Faces occasionally lit by the cherry from their cigarette, but I don't see that specific guy, and I just wanted to make sure he was okay. One guy pipes up and asks me if I saw him. Yeah, I reply, of course I saw him, just need to know if there's a man overboard or something. He puffs his cigarette and slowly explains to me that the guy in question is deceased. He's a phantom that still haunts this location, after apparently getting into a love triangle and couldn't deal with it, and ended up taking his own life via rope. He then goes on to tell me that that isn't even the creepiest part. and that if I get the right permission, I should be able to go down to the skid and see if I see an entity. I agree, go talk to Chief Moon, and she says it's just about fine. When I go down there, I see a guy standing in the corner, back facing the ladder. In the dim light, I asked if he was okay. The eerie sounds from there started to get to me, and I asked again, but he didn't reply. I just booked it. As I was informed by others, it's advisable to never go down there at night. I don't think it was someone just messing with me. For sure, that place was haunted. At the time, I was working as a live-in volunteer EMT at the fire department in my hometown. I lived in Maine, right near the New Hampshire border. It's a beautiful little vacation town. I miss it a lot actually, and visit it often. It's a one-streetlight slow town with more trees than people. A lot of the firefighters in our town were born into it, and I'm no exception. My mother was the emergency services chief, and we are all seasoned EMTs. She was a huge driving force in my life, and she pretty much made me into who I was at the time. A stone, cold, life-saving machine. I thrived on Red Bull and adrenaline. Now that I've got through that little backstory, you can start to understand that I am a rational person, and while I do believe in the supernatural, I'm not one to see a flickering light and cry, "Ghost!" This experience nearly made me quit my lifelong dream and leave the department I literally grew up in. I can't explain it. It was night shift, and I was part of a brand new live-in program to jumpstart our new EMT program. The chief said I was good during the day, but wanted me to have a couple more people with me at night. For the record, I'm non-binary, but at the time I was identifying as female due to paperwork and general confusion in life. So as such, I was accompanied by two of my lifelong friends, big, tall, muscular guys who also didn't scare easy. They also, for the record, did not believe in the paranormal. Tom and Charlie. So there we were in the dispatch room, which is basically where all the radios and security cameras are. There's a crappy old box TV in the corner playing Andy Griffith refunds at 1 a.m. You know, small town stuff. We have a door alarm in the vehicle bay, and when someone walks into the building, it'll chime a loud ding-dong through the whole damn station. Whenever someone leaves through the same door, it chimes a single ding. So imagine our surprise when we heard that telltale ding-dong sound through the building. Now I mean these are loud, you can't miss or mistake them. One of my friends says that it must be the chief checking on us, and I say yeah, she hasn't been sleeping too well. She often liked to make sure we were okay. So we looked up to the monitors and expect to see her walking up the doors. But there was no one. Then another loud ding-dong, and another. Bug must be blocking the sensor, one of them goes. Then it abruptly stopped. We look at each other, door open and called out, "Chief?" No answer. I took a deep breath, grabbed my radio, and told the two guys to watch the monitors, and that if they see anything, to have dispatch send a sheriff our way. They agreed, and I started my sweep. It was just to rule anything out and to be safe. This was during the rise of the drug crisis, and despite being a secure building, drug addicts are crafty, and it's better safe than sorry. I went around and in each fire truck, all good. With each truck I checked, I just felt silly. No one was here, I was just being paranoid. But as I stepped around engine 2, I saw what I swore was the hem of a little girl's dress darting around the forestry. What the hell? Allie? Allie was the fire kid's chief, but her being here in the middle of the night without the chief was strange. Was something wrong? I chased after her, but when I got there, nothing again. I felt dread, raw fear gripping me. My radio started crackling and I checked around me. I looked in every friggin' room for that girl and there was no sign of her, and the more I looked, the louder the static got. Suddenly the static stopped, and a crystal clear girl's voice came through it said, "You can't save everyone." The guys found me 20 minutes later sitting on the ambulance cot sobbing. I really was that messed up. One of my worst fears as a newbie EMT at the time was triage. For those of you who don't know, triage is when you have multiple patients, you have to decide who gets saved first, and who's basically already dead, and who is okay enough to wait for additional resources. That night, we had 3 separate multi-patient incidents. For many reasons I won't go into detail about them, but I seriously contemplated quitting. I don't know if it was someone messing with me that night over the radio, but I still sometimes have nightmares about that night. I've seen some weird and messed up stuff, but this one is the one that stuck with me the most. I was a police officer working the desk from 3 till 11 when a fire alarm signal goes off. Many years ago, the police department offered alarm monitoring services, and we still had about 12 places that were hardwired and would require pulling apart a lot of equipment to disconnect the system, so we just kept it going. The first shift dispatch is already punched in, so she took it. I'm heading out the door to the fire department when I get a 911 call from the same address. I answer it, and there's no one on the other end, and assumed they barely got to the call before passing out. At that moment, I bolt out the back door, hop in the squad car, and radio in the 911 call on the channel 3 that both police and fire can hear, and that I'm going directly to the house. I arrive just as another unit shows up, but there's no sign of smoke, no sign of anything. An older woman comes walking up the street, pushing a wheelchair, and an elderly lady, her mother. They live there, and just went out for an early evening stroll before dinner. I tell them what we have going on, and they inform me that no one else lives there, and as far as the elderly lady can remember, the alarms were disconnected from the house years ago during some renovations. They didn't have an alarm system either, just a few smoke and fire detectors. We do a walk around the house to get to the back door off the kitchen, and you can clearly see and smell gas. We turned off the gas at the main, set up some fans to air it out, and find the cracked gas liner going to the oven. The daughter said she spilled some coffee she was making for their walk and had to move the oven a few inches to clean it. She probably broke the line, pushing the oven back in. Nothing else in the house was disturbed, and both phones were on the hook. The fire chief shows up about 15 minutes into the call. He goes over to the 2 ladies and gives them both hugs, and he's nearly in tears. The elderly lady in the wheelchair, you see, her husband was the fire chief 60+ years ago for our department. The daughter, her husband, passed away a few years ago. He was also a member of our department. I never believed in ghosts and spirits, but that call made me think, maybe people who spend their lives doing good are allowed by some power to look over their loved ones every so often. My partner and I were dispatched to do a welfare check. It was an elderly gentleman that no one had seen in a few days. It was the classic scenario. Mail was overflowing in the mailbox. He had missed a doctor's appointment and his car hadn't been moved. Upon reading that information, we both knew we were about to find a body. We drove there, quite anxious, and when we arrive on the scene, we can't get anyone to open the door. We look through the window and sure enough, we can see his foot on the floor in the living room. Our suspicions confirmed. My partner is a corporal and pulls ranks and makes me go first. The door is unlocked, and as soon as we open it, we smell a mostly fresh, dead body. Almost relieved, we both enter, and he tells me to check vitals on the dead dude. He's obviously dead, with lividity. Dried feces on him, dried saliva around his mouth. So I go to stand over him and see if I can get a pulse, at which point he takes a deep breath and rolls over, and asks why we're in his house. At this point we both started screaming and ran out of the house. We called the emergency services and they transported him and said they couldn't get a blood pressure or pulse on him. I think he died a week later in the hospital, and I still get jokes about raising the dead. I work graveyard shifts as an unarmed security guard. I've had the same post since starting with the company, now going on a year. It's in a fairly busy metropolitan area, but it's really quiet at night. There's a police station practically across the street, so I'm mostly just there to satisfy the insurance company on the off chance someone's brazen enough to try and steal building materials. The main area of the project is an office building. There's a multi-level parking structure that is attached. Also, mid-construction, the rear of the property is bordered by a tall concrete wall, after which there is a busy highway running parallel. Well, one night, maybe a week or two after Thanksgiving, I was sitting in my car, deep into an especially long and depraved session of Plague Inc., during which I repeatedly killed off all of Earth's inhabitants through various torturous and sadistic means. A thin layer of snow had already accumulated on my windshield since my last patrol. I couldn't really see out of it per se, but I had civilizations to neutralize. Being a good security guard is all about knowing your priorities. That all changed when something violently rattled my car. While I do have a gun, I do keep nunchuku on me at all times. Blue belt in Kung Fu, thank you very much. So I grabbed those and my Nebo O2 beam flashlight and jumped out of the car. I can't imagine what would be responsible for the disturbance, so I assumed that my field supervisor had something to do with it. He didn't have much of a sense of humor, but he made it a point to try and sneak up on unaware guards, although he wasn't very good at it. It's weird though. I exit my car and there's no one in sight. There's a thin layer of snow on the ground, so footprints or tire tracks would have been an obvious giveaway. I was about to write it off as a strange environmental effect when it happened again. I didn't feel like a shaking thing when I was on my feet though, more like a high amplitude current in the ground. Now I'm on high alert, so I switched to the emergency scanner app on my phone to see if they're getting any phone calls about an earthquake or explosion or something. There's no communication for a good 5 minutes, then some run-of-the-mill chatter about a drunk driver on the other side of town. I'm a little spooked now, but rather than get back in the car, I decide to do my next patrol a little early. I knew there was nothing to worry about, but figured it would put my mind at ease to check the site for myself just in case. I started by looking around the parking structure. There was only one accessible entrance, which my car was parked in front of, but squatters are a thing and it was a cold night. Nothing. I still had one earbud in on the off chance that people started calling in. There's a domestic disturbance call, and then silence. Then the rumbling comes back. The whole structure feels like it's wobbling. I just check the last corner and decide to get out of there in case something decided to collapse. Just as I leave the garage, something in my periphery catches my attention. On top of the building, there are a few security lights, but one is completely obscured by a lift and construction materials. So when I tell you that I saw the silhouette of a man on top of the building, understand that it really was just a silhouette. My paranoia is pretty peaked at this point, which I factored into my assessment of the situation while taking no comfort from it whatsoever. I decided to grab my binoculars out of the car, which I felt confident would reveal the silhouette to be nothing more than heightened paranoia and a stack of 2x4s. When I got back to the car, I just about lost my mind. There was an impression in the snow, like someone had laid across my hood. 2 handprints were melted into the windshield. No footprints or tire tracks, except for the ones I knew without question I had made. I pulled out my smartphone, not really sure what I hoped to do with it, but you understand the impulse. It was off. Battery dead. Before I got out of the car, the phone had been plugged in and was charging, over 90% battery. Then I felt the rumble again, and I promptly got into the car after checking the back seat and drove it to the other end of the site. If there was a squatter there, I conceded victory. Either way, I never got complaints from the foreman or supervisors. I asked one of the other guards if he'd seen anything weird while working, and he just shrugged. To this day, I still have no idea what happened. We went to an apartment which was a local drug den. A female we knew called and said the male renter had been assaulted and she had to run. We got there and the door was bolted shut. I kicked the door over and over again and it wouldn't open. What I found out later is the dope team had done a search warrant on the apartment a few weeks earlier, and afterwards the tenants had reinforced the door jamb with a metal plate. It took me a total of 22 attempts kicking the door before I broke the deadbolt in half, which flew across the room and hit a wall. We made entry, guns drawn, and started clearing the apartment. This place was the kind of spooky I have only seen in places where a lot of meth is done. It was dark. There were swastikas, 666, and upside-down pentagrams painted on the walls, pictures of faces hung on the walls with the eyes X'd out, and a baby doll with her eyes scratched out with X's. As we cleared the first room, we started seeing the blood, first on the bed, then a trail on the floor leading into the back room. The layout was weird. One main room, then a back room, which was more a hallway, and a bathroom at the end of the hall. We followed the trail of blood down the hall to the bathroom door. In front of the door was a renter's dog, which was shaking uncontrollably and pissing all over the floor, scared out of its mind. As we got closer, the dog got really aggressive because it was scared. I made my way around the dog and entered the bathroom, where I found the renter hunched over in the shower, bleeding from his face, holding his cheeks with his hand. He was frantically trying to talk, pleading with us not to hurt the dog. Blood was dripping from his mouth, and I couldn't understand him. Then I saw the extent of what happened to him. His jaw had been dislocated on both sides when he was beaten by two men with a hammer, and it was just hanging on. As he was trying to plead with us, he could only attempt to talk by flicking his blood-covered tongue in the pattern of the words, because his jaw didn't work at all. Turns out the guy was a lower-level drug dealer, and he had been attacked by the two brothers, of whose other brother died of an overdose several years prior. The brothers always blamed the dealer for providing the drugs to their brother. They got drunk at a bar and assaulted the guy on their deceased brother's birthday. I know one of the guys since he was released from prison, and he's actually a really nice guy, kind-hearted, believe it or not. They just let their anger out, and it was a bit misguided. I know it's an understatement, but I can understand how someone could get into that frame of mind. The guy ended up going to hospital, and I assumed he turned out alright, as when he was released he went to collect his dog, but I don't know much more after that. I was an EMT for a while, and we got a call about someone who was riding their bike at a breakneck speed when they hit a car head first without a helmet. We went over immediately, and despite the fact it was broad daylight and we were in the middle of suburbia on a Saturday, no one even came to check on this poor guy. Seriously, the streets were empty. Usually a massive crowd gathers around violent accidents like this. His skull was pretty much smashed in and he was unresponsive. It was the worst head injury I'd ever seen. We assessed that he had a major skull fracture, a concussion, and he was bleeding profusely. He was also missing teeth and had a minor road rash, but fortunately he wasn't missing much skin. To give you an idea of how bad it was, this is the kind of injury that most people won't survive. If you did survive, you'd likely be a crippled vegetable. Normally we would have moved him off the road, but when someone has a head or neck injury, that isn't very safe. My partner, who was also training me, as I was still kind of new, went to check for his pulse while I began to unload our gear. He crouched down, felt for a pulse for a while, and then stood up and opened his mouth to say something. Suddenly the guy jumped up. He didn't use his arms to pick himself up, he just jumped to his feet. It startled the hell out of us. He looked at us, smiled, and attempted to grab his bike. We tried to stop him, but we didn't exactly want to wrestle him to the ground given his condition. He gets away from us and bolts into the woods without his bike. My partner was even more in disbelief than I was. He just stared at us where the man had run off to, mouth agape. He then turned to me and muttered, "The guy had no pulse, man." I asked him if he was sure, and he swore up and down that the biker was clinically dead. We contacted the authorities for assistance, and they sent a search and rescue team into the forest. I don't know if he was found or not, because we don't get much information about patients after they go to the professionals. Keep in mind this was in the Pine Barrens, so they had a lot of ground to cover. My best guess is that he went to a loved one's house out of confusion, but what I found odd about all this is that head injuries bleed like hell, so you'd think the guy would leave a long red trail of blood for the cops to follow. The year was 1990, and I was working in New York City as a paramedic and got pushed into this service. Let me give you a bit of context. 2 years before, at a place called the Happy Land Social Club, they received an inspection and were told that they had to shut down for building code violations for lack of fire exits, alarms, or sprinkler systems. But the fire department, being busy as it was, gave them no follow-up, and they never did so. Well, on the fateful night in 1990, a man called Julio Gonzalez got into an argument with his girlfriend who worked at the club taking coats. She told him that she didn't want to see him again, and he got angry. He went to an Amoco gas station and returned with a plastic container of $1 worth of gasoline. He hastily spread the fuel at the base of the staircase, which was the only access in or out of the club, and then ignited the gasoline. 87 people died in the resulting fire. 19 bodies were found downstairs and the others upstairs. 6 bodies were found within several feet of the front door. It was not a pleasant sight. 150 firefighters responded to the blaze, which was extinguished in 5 minutes. The guy was caught the next afternoon and was sentenced to prison, but he died within prison at age 61 of a heart attack. But taking you back to that night, the city had to borrow vans to remove the bodies into various areas for holding. Our borrowed van gave up after one of the several trips we had to take, with 4 bodies bagged in the back of the van for another van to come empty us to the wreck so that they could take the van away. Another old Ford van backs up into ours, and we began the slow process of lifting the bags by the corners and handing your handholds to the guy in the other van so they could gingerly slide the body over. Mind you, this is on a street in the Bronx, and as I lift one of the bags I hear a whistle in the bag. That was concerning. There could have been a person still alive in there, so I violated the seal and opened the bag just to be sure that it wasn't a mistake. But it wasn't. When airways meet superheated gas, the edema closes them, and as we moved the body, the air was released from the chest and through a space in a shiny gold tooth. Hence, the body whistled at me. Grills still make my skin itch to this day. I was working as a paramedic, and my station had a mental hospital in our area. They knew they weren't allowed to call us for basic transports, and there had to be an emergency. We get a call there one night for a possible stroke on the 4th floor. We knew that the 4th floor is where they kept people who were guilty of murder and rape, etc., and that a police officer would be with us. When we get there, the nurse has a look on her face that we are really about to walk into something sketchy, and she tells us that the lady won't stop looking to her left, which was her excuse for calling us and saying it was a stroke, and talking to something. When we walk into the room, she's in full conversation with something outside the window. We ask her to talk to us and she got quiet. We load her up and the law enforcement officer cuffs her to the gurney. When we get outside, she looks back towards the window and then quickly shoots her head to the other side and said, "It's cool how fast they fly." About 5 minutes from the hospital, She asks me if I'm worried about the ambulance because it's about to break down, and that her and her yellow flying friends are about to rape and kill us. I said no, and she started this screeching laughter that I'll never forget. The law enforcement officer was as white as snow and said nothing to her. We drop her off in the ER, come back outside, and the ambulance had cut off and wouldn't start. I went back inside to ask the law enforcement officer if he had turned it off, and they said that he hadn't walked in with us. We couldn't find him, and dispatch sent a bunch of cars out to look for him as he wasn't at the hospital. They found him sitting in his cruiser back at the mental hospital, and he couldn't remember how he got there. To this day, I really think her and the law enforcement officer saw something. When I first joined the police, during our first 2 days of training school, we had this lecture from an officer who had been in the force a long time, at least 20 years. He told us some of his weird experiences while policing. He said he'd been out on patrol in a car when they got a call to an abandoned house. He got there and it was a big house, sort of isolated. They knocked on the door and no one answered, so we went to open the door and it was unlocked. He walked in. The house was empty, no people, no furniture, no possessions, completely vacant. He looked around and found no one there, but then he looked upstairs and thought he saw someone move. He went upstairs. It was a really big house with a long hall upstairs, and when he got up there he saw someone going to the bedroom right at the end of the hall. He followed the person there, calling out as he went. Again, all the other rooms were completely empty, even of furniture. When he got to the room, he saw the person going in, and he found it completely empty. No one was in it, and nothing was there apart from a long mirror. He walked into the room and looked into the mirror. He told us he saw something in the mirror that he said has haunted him for the rest of his life. He said he wouldn't tell us what he saw, and said he'd never tell anyone, but that it terrified him. He turned around and left the room to leave, and as he walked down the hallway he saw that all the rooms were now filled with furniture. No one was there still, but the house no longer looked abandoned. He said he left the house that day, never knowing what happened or who had called the police, but was absolutely positive of what he'd seen. He was completely serious, and it was obvious that he really believed in what he'd seen, and it gave me chills down my spine when he was telling us. I've never forgotten it. I was working in a small rural hospital ER. The morgue and autopsy room were adjacent to the ER, and a couple of EMTs came in to the break room and for a chat, as it was a slow night. They asked me if I'd ever seen a drowning victim. I told them no, and they wanted to show me the body in the morgue. So we went in there and pulled out the drawer, and there's this body laying on the tray. They are pointing out some stuff to me, when suddenly they both ran out the door and flipped the light off. Now I'm standing a foot away from a dead body in the dark. Damn them. I worked my way over to the door and tried to get out, but they were holding the door and laughing hysterically. So I decided to be real quiet, and after a few minutes they began to worry. I could hear one of them say, "Do you think she fainted?" Then the door began to open slowly. As soon as I could get a foot in it and a grip on it, I yanked it open and cussed the crap out of them. Morgue after midnight? No thank you. I'm a first responder. This call happened probably 2 years ago. We got a call for a woman who fell down the stairs and hit her head. The cops beat us there and began talking with the woman. We, me and my partner, get there and start looking at her head. She says she takes medicine but is unsure what type, so she told me to go to her bathroom and check her medicine cabinet for the pills she takes. When I get to the staircase to head upstairs, immediately there are gunshots. Thankfully, my ninja reflexes saved me. I'm joking. I think the guy just fired random shots down the stairs near me. The cops did not hesitate to take him out, didn't even fire a shot. After the gunshots at me, there were no more shots. The guy came out peacefully. I mean, it would have made sense for her to tell her husband that she was getting seen to and called an ambulance, but there you go. I was a police officer for a metro department for 7 years, before having to be medically retired. While at work one day, my partner and I were sent to a call of a family member who had found their sister, Donna, dead in her home. After a short investigation, medics pronounced her deceased, and after a conversation with the medical examiner and our sergeant, Donna's body was released to the funeral home. There was only one bathroom in the home and it was upstairs. Donna's bedroom was also upstairs across the bathroom. Donna had taken the door off her bedroom, as it was a small bedroom and there wasn't room for it to close with the bed inside. Donna had passed away as if she was praying at her bedside, but needed to nap. Her family asked we cover her with a blanket for her dignity, and for when they needed to use the bathroom. I went back upstairs and covered her up with a blanket from her bed and said, "There you go, dear." As I turned to leave the room, I heard, "Thank you," clear as day from behind me. I turned around and saw nothing had changed, but I had this overwhelming feeling of gratitude and contentment. I am an atheist and have been for a very long time. The majority of things I saw at work reaffirmed my lack of beliefs, but after this encounter, I definitely believe in spirits and energy. While working as a firefighter, I've had a few seriously dangerous situations that have almost brought my death. There was this one time the air pack regulator malfunctioned while I was deep inside of a working structure fire. I ran out of air with no warning and thought at that moment I was going to die. Thankfully, I managed to make it out, but the fear that hits you when you have no air is something I wish on no one. On another occasion, we had been called to a fire, and there was a burning roof and a wall collapse on my partner and I. I literally was trapped and unable to squirm out. The intense heat pressing down on me, and my oxygen quickly depleting as I waited to get dug out. I was pretty sure at that moment that I was about to get roasted alive, and saw my life flash before my eyes. I was very lucky to have made it out of that one with my life. This happened about 3 years ago. I got dispatched for traffic control by a fellow company for lines down on a high traffic road. It's about 7:30 a.m. We got on the scene and see a big-ass wire hanging smack dab in the middle of the road. What we don't realize was that there was a big-ass triaxle logging truck laying in the ditch 20 feet away that we passed driving on the scene. At first glance on arrival, I literally said, "Looks like the neighboring company has a big-ass tree down." Nope. What it was the truck was covered in logs. Somehow the driver survived and was walking around. That 7:30 a.m. call wasn't finished till 4 p.m. I missed my college classes and was almost crushed and/or ran over several times while running traffic due to a member's call, whom I still want to punch square in the lower jaw. I am a firefighter, and I took a small team to the rear of a home that was fully engulfed in flames. I kick in the door and kneel down into the corner. I start hitting the fire across the room when my right side got hot. Turns out I was leaning against a couch that lit up quickly, but no one else could see because of the smoke and the wall between us. So naturally I turned my attention to it and put it out. It was about that time I feel a tap on my shoulder and one of the guys was saying to hit the ceiling. I had almost instantly become engulfed, so while putting it out, some ammunition across the room started popping off. We decided to pull back out, and I was the last one to exit, and what was left of the ceiling collapsed and almost crushed me. And that was the time that I nearly perished on the job. Being a firefighter is not for the faint of heart. I am a medic and firefighter, and I had a call once. I don't remember what we were initially called for, but they told the dispatch that they were in the barn. Something seemed off and we looked through a window before going in. A shotgun was pointed at the door and rigged to fire if the door opened. The caller had hung themselves in the barn before we got there. My very first call as a medic after orientation with an EMT partner that tried to stab me. I've also had a gun pulled on me while I walked up to a vehicle involved in a rollover. He seemed to be fully intending to shoot, and I was lucky enough to notice and react quickly enough. So as you can see, my job has nearly had me lose my life on multiple occasions. I was living in Lacey, Washington when this happened. I was living in an apartment complex located just off Ruddell Road. The road has a nasty curve, not far away, that was prone to car accidents, especially at night, some serious while others fatal. One evening while watching TV in the living room, the power suddenly flickered and then blinked out. Seconds later I could hear the sound of a car crashing on the main road. In the silence that followed, I decided to put on my shoes and black trench coat and run up the road to see if anyone needed help. When I got to the road, I immediately looked to my left where the infamous curve was. There, in the small stand of trees that lined the road, was an overturned car. From what I could tell, the car had taken out a power pole on the other side of the road before careening into the small stand of trees, coming to rest on its hood. Next to the car, there was a small yet thick crowd of people standing in a circle. I jogged over, having to practically push my way through the crowd to find out what they were silently staring at. At the center of this macabre crowd is a young woman. She was moaning and writhing around, eyes wide with terror and wet with tears, as she kept scanning the crowd of silent observers, pleading for help with her gaze. I dashed in, knelt down beside her and grasped her left hand. The crowd took a collective step back, and then I suddenly remembered the story from my childhood. My stomach sank. These were them, the people. You see, I once read a young adult book series called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark that as a child I would often check out from the public library. In one of the books, there's a particular story by Ray Bradbury called The Crowd, which is about a man who ends up in a car wreck. After being dug out of the car, he finds himself surrounded by a thick crowd of people silently watching. They don't move or speak, they just stare down at him. When the paramedics arrive, the crowd vanishes. This was the only story in the series that truly frightened me. Little did I know that years later, this story would prepare me for my own real-life encounter with the crowd. As I looked upon them, it was real. It was all around us, and I felt like I was keeping this crowd from coming closer and doing who knows what. "Just look at me. Just look at me," I said, trying to push my fear down. To my relief, her eyes flickered to mine, and I told her, "You're going to be okay. You're going to be fine. Has anyone called 911 yet?" There was no response from the crowd. I quickly fished my cell phone from my pocket and dialed it myself, one hand on the phone, the other on the woman's hand. It was an agonizing few minutes before the paramedics arrived, and I kept speaking to her, both to calm her and myself, while simultaneously looking up at the people. When the paramedics finally arrived, the crowd abruptly vanished, exactly like in the story. I didn't let go of the woman's hand until I was literally a shoulder width from the paramedics. At that point, I walked back to the sidewalk and looked around. There were only a few neighbors at the opposite end of the street watching what was going down. Other than that, the street was deserted. I shuddered, looked at the woman one more time, and then ran back home. To this day, I can't remember what the ending was of this scary story, and I feel like I don't need to know. I saw it with my own eyes. I was once working in a morgue when a body came in. They informed me and asked me if I wanted to leave, and I responded that now I'll keep on working, when they brought in a rather sizable cadaver. They shut the door to the lab, and the next thing I heard is, "Oh crap, we should put him on the deeper table." Then the smell hit me. I had to go outside for about 20 minutes until the lead mortician came out and got me and explained to me that they had to switch the body fluids with embalming fluids for open caskets. When it's a larger human, they have a special tray table to let the blood etc. pour out onto the table. Well, the rookie just started doing the job he knew how to do, and the blood work was pouring all over the sides of the tray. It was one of the worst things I've ever seen. When I was in grade 6, I lived on Prince Edward Island, and we had the opportunity to talk to an officer. At the end, we got to ask a few questions, and of course there'd be the typical questions that kid would ask, like, "Did you ever shoot anyone?" He shot at but didn't actually shoot anyone, or so he told us. Then someone asks, "What's the creepiest thing you've ever seen?" I probably don't remember all the details because it was years ago, but it went kind of like this. There was a small island just off the coast of Prince Edward Island, and one night people had called the police to report a baby crying from the island. The police show up, and sure enough they heard a baby crying. They make their way over to the cries, but when they got to the island the crying stopped. They searched everywhere, and guess what they found? Nothing. No baby or any sign that someone might be there. They started to leave the island, and immediately the baby starts crying. Of course, they go back and it stops. I can't remember how long they were looking, but they never found anything. And you could tell it's been bothering him for a long time by the way he talked about it. It always creeped me out, and I'll doubt I'll never forget about it. Weird things happen on Prince Edward Island. I've only been an EMT for about 6 months. I had someone I had known for years walk up to me and say, "I don't feel well," and drop. Unresponsive to pain, breathing getting slower and weaker, no team to support me, and no prep time on my way to the scene or anything. I was pretty shaken afterwards, but it made me realize that the training works. By the time the ambulance responded, which was just a few minutes away, I had blood pressure, oxygen, blood sugar, and had him on oxygen while monitoring the breathing and getting ready to start bagging him. While this was a bit scary, it also gave me a lot more confidence in my abilities. I work in a pre-Civil War town that has lots of antebellum homes that survived the war. As you can imagine, ghost hunters have been to the town on several occasions. But there is one antebellum mansion that is more of a museum that gets alarm calls semi-frequently. Every time we get a call about the side door opening, we have to go and check. And when we do so, not only do we find that no one has ever trespassed, but the most unsettling thing of all is that every cabinet door and drawer in the kitchen is always open, every single time. We've spoken to the caretaker about it on multiple occasions, and he says that it's been happening since he started looking after the place 30 years ago. Because as you probably suspected, those drawers and cupboards were definitely not left open before we got there. Now, we don't clear the place without backup. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope you did enjoy tonight's collection of stories. Why not subscribe and press the bell icon if you did? And I'd like to extend an extra thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. For signing up, you get a bunch of extra perks and rewards, and if you'd like to find out what, you can follow the link in the description. But for now, more stories can be found on screen. Thank you to all my members and patrons for your continued support, and hopefully see you in the next one. Good night.